Hello and welcome. I'm Dave. Today we will take a deep dive into revalidating data with Next.js and the incremental static regeneration process. And I'll provide links to all resources in the description below. I'll also provide a link for you to join my Discord server where you can discuss web development with other students, and you can ask questions that I can answer and receive help from other viewers too. I look forward to seeing you there. Today's starting code is the completed code from Lesson 6, where we built a blog project. Today's lesson is Lesson 10 in the series, but you're going to find the starting code under Lesson 6 in the course resources that are linked in the description. So after the blog project in Lesson 6, I received several questions about ISR, that's incremental static regeneration, and how to apply revalidation to the blog or other similar projects without rebuilding the project every time a new blog article is added. So today, I really want to break down the ISR process and show how you can use it with and without fetch. So this should not only help the current project that we're working on, but also it will work if you're using fetch with a headless content management service, also known as a CMS. Now, also note, I'm using Next.js 13.2.4 today. Currently, 13.3 still has a few bugs to work out. Now, in the future, I hope that's not the case, and you may even be working with a stable release that's higher if you're watching this video at a later time. But right now, I'm using 13.2.4. Now, if we look at the structure of the app over here in the file tree, you can see I'm not using the source directory here, which would just be a parent directory for many of these other things. But right now, if we look at the structure of the app, we'll just look inside of the app directory, you can see we have a page. And with this page, we are bringing in a posts component. Now, this is what we need to update. It's going to display all of the posts. So when we add a new article or a new post, then we want that added to the list so users or visitors to our website can click on that new blog post. So from there, let's look at that post component. And we can see, I'm looking inside of the dynamic directory. Sorry, we need to look inside of components where we have the posts component where we bring that in to the main page. Now here we are and generating that list of posts, and you can see we are calling a function called getSortedPostData. Now we're not using fetch here. Notice we're not awaiting this. It's all on the server already. And if we look inside of our lib directory here for our library, we can see this post.tsx, and let's look inside of this. And actually, we could have named that just TS as well. It looks like I named those TSX, but they are not components that have JSX in them, for example. So you could just name these TS if you want to. But anyway, inside of here, we've got the getSortedPostData, and it's gathering those markdown files where we create the new blog posts and it pulls them in. So we're not using fetch, but we can still revalidate with or without fetch. And then here, of course, inside of the blog post directory, we see our markdown files. There's one for each article for our blog, and we'll be creating a new fake one today as well. So that's the overall breakdown of the application. And we're just really going to focus on back here in the app directory on our main page that pulls in the posts. Now I'm back in the beta docs here for Next.js, and we're talking about revalidating data. And it says there are two types of revalidation in Next.js. The first is background revalidation, and it revalidates the data at a specific time interval. That's what we'll be doing today. And then later on, we'll learn about on-demand revalidation, and we're also going to learn how to do that. But first, we'll look at background. If we scroll down here, it shows how we have learned this before in a previous lesson. We had set this with fetch. We have the next property here, and then we set an object inside there that says revalidate, and we give it the number. But we can also use a route segment configuration, and I will go to this page, but here's an example of it, and it just says export const revalidate and sets the number. Now you can set that in a page for the tree that that page is in, and if that page is a parent, it applies to the rest of the tree. However, the fetch request, if you have a fetch inside of the tree that's also using this route segment config, the fetch will override whatever is here. So you can still set individual values for different fetches if you want to. Let's look at this route segment config page. Now here it took me directly to the revalidate part of the page, but I'm going to scroll to the top because there are other configs as well, and we'll be looking at two. One is the dynamic params. Now this default here, it shows all the default values. This is set to true, and that's important because when we add a new blog post, a new markdown file essentially, when it's not inside of the generate static params function, it didn't exist earlier when we built the site, for example, well then it's important that we can use dynamic parameters as well to get any new blog post articles, so they will also be available. And notice here, an important note is that it can only be applied to page, layout, or route handlers. So as far as our front-end app goes, it could only be applied to the page or layout. That's where we will put these configs. Let me quickly scroll down to the dynamic params section that we were talking about, just so we can see a little bit more about that. And here's what we need to note, that the true is the default, and it says dynamic segments not included in generate static params are generated on demand. That's important for our new articles. And now if I scroll further down to our revalidate section, we're going to set this. Notice the default is false, and that's not what we want. We're going to set this to a low number so we can see the revalidation happen very quickly. Now when you deploy, you would probably set this to a high number. Maybe a common value would be 86,400, which would be all of the seconds in one day. So you're essentially setting it to 1 day, where it would revalidate at that interval. But remember, we will also learn about on-demand revalidation and how that works as well. Okay, I'm back in VS Code and I'm in our page. Remember, this is one of the only places we can put the route config options that we want to, either a page file or a layout file. So even though I'm talking about the post list that I'm importing from components, I need to put that config here inside of the page.tsx file. So here at the top, let's put export const and then revalidate, and I'm going to set this very low, so like 10 seconds right now. That's what the number is equal to. And like I said, later if you were to deploy, you'd set this very high, like 86,400 would be 1 day. But let's just set it to 10 seconds for now, because I can talk over 10 seconds and then of course we can revalidate and see what happens. Now when it comes to the dynamic params config that we saw, we don't even need to set that because we're already using the default value, so that's already applied. So with this revalidate config now applied, we cannot test this inside of the dev mode. So we really need to build our site and then we can test it when we run the build. So let's type npm run build, and I'll come back after it's built and we'll look at the results. Okay, the build has completed. Let's scroll up here quickly and look. Now notice our homepage where we're importing that post list is considered to be static. And then we have SSG here for the dynamic posts that are of course using the generate static params as well. And that's why they're SSG. We had learned that earlier in the series, I believe around lesson 4. But it's important to note that this is static, but by applying the proper revalidation, this incremental static regeneration format or design that we can use, then we're going to be able to see our new post eventually anyway without rebuilding the site. So now let's go ahead and start the build we just created with npm start, and we'll make sure that's running. And it's currently running now. Now let's look over at our blog posts, and we have 2 of these here. So I need to create one more, but I'm going to create it out here in the root area for now. So I'll create a new file. I'm just going to call this new.md. Now I'll come inside of one we already have. I'll close the terminal for now. I'm going to copy everything and then just paste it into the new one and alter a couple of things here. So let's make this 4 and let me see, maybe today's the 19th. So we'll go with that. And then I'll just put my new post up here for the title. We can leave the body the same. So this will be our new file when we put it in the blog post. But first, we just want to look at our application without the new post in there. And to do that, I'm going to press Control and the back tick, open up the terminal window here, and we have our localhost 3000. I'll hold down the Control key and click, and it's going to launch this in a new browser window. That's fine. We've got our 2 posts listed here, so we can navigate to each one of those, go back to the home page. I could also use the back to home that's down here as well. Everything's working as expected, and it's very fast because these are SSG articles, so everything's behaving as if it's a static page, and it loads very quickly right now. Now back in VS Code, I'm going to drag this new blog post into our blog post directory. And we still have our site running. We did not rebuild the site. That's important to note. We just put a new article in our blog post directory. So back in the browser now, as we navigate from article to article and back to the home page, we're being served cached versions of these articles and the home page. But notice, after I navigated away twice and came back, then we see the new blog post. So it didn't happen right away. It took 2 clicks. So that's important to note. So I want to go back once more to VS Code and bring this back out. So we no longer have that there. And of course, after we come back to the home page now, I'll be able to refresh, but it should take twice. There's 1 refresh. There's 2 refreshes, and now it changed. Let's talk about why it takes 2. And I think I can demonstrate that best by putting the blog article back in and showing how this works once again, and just using refreshes instead of clicking away and clicking back. So now we have our new blog article back in the blog post folder, and now out here, we're not displaying the new one. So when I refresh the first time, we don't get it. The first refresh or reload after the revalidation number, essentially 10 seconds in this case, has passed. So after 10 seconds, the first refresh or reload of the page essentially triggers the revalidation, but while it is revalidating, it still serves the old version. So the first request triggers it, the second request gets the new version. And that's not what everybody expects to happen. I think they expect to see it right away, so that taking 2 times, either 2 clicks away and back or 2 refreshes, throws some off. But it's important to understand that that's how it works. And let's go back to the docs to see how they outline this process. Okay, back in the beta docs, we're on the revalidating page and we're looking at how it works. So it says when a request is made to the route that was statically rendered at build time, it initially shows the cached data. That's what we expect. But then any request to the route after the initial request, and in their example, they use 60 seconds instead of 10, but any requests before that time period are also cached and they're instantly responded to. But after the time period, the 60-second window they give, we gave 10 seconds, the next request will still show the cached, or you could consider it stale data. And that's what we got after the first refresh. But it triggers a regeneration of the data in the background. And then after that successfully regenerates, the next time you request data, it's going to invalidate the cache and show that updated route. So then we see the updated information that has the new blog post in it. And that's how the process works. Now remember, we're not using fetch, but if you are using fetch, whether it's with a Sanity IO request or some other headless CMS, or you're requesting data from an API somewhere or who knows where, you can, of course, specify the revalidate number right inside of the fetch request, and this will override what you might have for a route config as well. And remember, your route config can only go inside of the page or layout for your front-end app. Now, all this is great, you say, and of course, we can set that number higher, like 86,400 seconds, so that's not going to be 10 seconds, and we would have to wait that whole time, of course, to have 2 requests go through after a day passed to then get new data on our site, and we may not want that to happen. And in that case, we can use what's called on-demand revalidation. I'll just scroll down further on the page, and we see it right here. So what on-demand revalidation will allow us to do is after we create a new blog post, we can hit an API endpoint that revalidates the data and then, of course, updates the site immediately when it gets the next request. So we're essentially putting in the first request ahead of time that would trigger the revalidation. So now let's go back to VS Code and we'll apply this. Okay, I'm back in VS Code. I'm going to go ahead and press Control-C to stop the application for now. Close the terminal window. I'll also drag that new article back out here into a top level, and we'll put it back when we're ready to as well. And while I'm in the top level, what we need to do is create a .env.local file, as we're going to use an environment variable. So .env.local, and of course it should match a pattern that is in the git ignore. So if you have a repository on GitHub, you would want this in here so it does not add your .env.local to that GitHub repository. You never want your environment variable values stored in GitHub. So I'm going to call this environment variable my_secret_. underscore token, and that matches the docs if you're looking at the docs as we go. And you could put any value here you want. I'm going to show you how to generate one as well, but I'm going to use a simple one that I'll remember, like Dave Gray teaches code. And you could do a phrase that you remember as well. We're going to use this later in the revalidation request URL. But now after we make that, let me show you how to generate one with Node also. So I'll press Control and the backtick to open the terminal. I'm going to type Node, so then I'm in the Node environment and I've got a prompt here where I can type Node commands. And I'm going to type require, and I'm going to bring in the crypto module. And then from there, I'm going to use dot notation and add random bytes. Notice I'm using camel case there with a capital B. And now inside of these parentheses, we can put essentially how long we want this token to be. Like a long one would be 64 or maybe even 32. I'll make a short one with just 16 here. Then we'll say toString, and inside of toString, we'll say to hex here. And now I'll just press enter, and this should generate a random token. So you could use this instead of my value Dave Gray teaches code, for example, and this would be your secret token value. So I just wanted to show you how to do that. Let's go ahead and exit out of the Node environment now by pressing Control-C twice, and now we're back out. Now we can close the terminal once again, and this would be our .env.local. That's all we need is a value for my secret token. Now, as we scroll back up, there is something about the revalidate request that we need to discuss because it's probably going to change, and that is currently it only works inside of the pages directory. And right now, when you create one of the new Next.js projects, it doesn't even create that pages directory. It needs to be at the same level as the app directory. So I could just highlight the .env.local file once again, create a new directory here, and name it pages. I do expect this to change, and maybe it will work with the other API directory that we have inside of the app directory in the future where our route handlers are. But for now, it must be in a pages directory. Okay, now inside of the pages directory, we'll create another API directory. And then inside of the API directory, we need a specially named file that is called revalidate.ts. Now, one question you might have as we discuss this is, will our route handlers still work here as we have a hello route? Yes, they will. And we could demonstrate that, or you could just test it out on your own. But yes, your example hello route handler for the new route handlers in the new API directory that's in the app folder will still work even though this pages API directory now exists. So now we're going to work inside of the revalidate.ts file. But let's quickly go back to the documentation. Back at the on-demand revalidation documentation, what we need to highlight is the URL that they are suggesting we use to request the revalidation. And so I'm just going to copy this here, and then we'll go back to VS Code and I'll put it in a comment. Back in VS Code, I'm going to put a comment here at the top of the file and just put their example URL. Now this is close to what we want to use, but I want to show you what we're going to use, and it's just a little different. So what I can do is actually just copy this down and modify it. So Shift Alt and the down arrow. The first thing we're going to do is not use HTTPS. Now, of course, after your site is deployed, then yes, you would use HTTPS. But just here in development, even though we're only going to use this on a build, we need to use HTTP on our local computer. So of course, as we're testing this on the local computer, this yoursite.com will need to be localhost 3000. Then it's going to go to API, revalidate, and here we're providing a parameter called secret, and then it's going to have a value. My value was Dave Gray teaches code. So this should match the secret you have in your .env.local file. But we need to add one more thing that they don't mention here, and that is a path, because we want our revalidation request to work for any path that we decide we need to revalidate. If we had a larger application, of course, that could be very handy. So I'm going to say path equals, and we need to revalidate the home page, the root. So it's just the slash, but then we need an ampersand before we get to the next param in the URL. Now I can press Alt-Z to wrap that down so you can see the full URL here. So we're providing two params, path equals our slash just for our home page, and then we have an ampersand, and then secret equals and whatever your secret value is. So So I just wanted these at the top for reference. Of course, you could delete them later if you want to, but I'm just giving the examples comparing to what is inside of the documentation. So now let's create this route handler for the revalidation request. And we're going to start by importing Next API request and also Next API response. And those are going to come from Next. After that, we'll go ahead and start our function. So export default async function, and let's just call it handler. And from here, we're going to have a request, and this is the Next API request. We'll also have a response, and this is the Next API response. Now let's just scroll up a little bit, and well, not quite that far. There we go. And from there, I'll put the curly braces, and we can create the rest of the handler here inside for the function. So the first thing we need to do is check our secret. So we'll say if request.query.secret is not equal to what we have in our env file. So our environment variable, that's process.env.my_secret_token. So if they are not equal, we're going to return right here. We will return the response status is a 401. And from here, we'll use JSON and provide a message and just say invalid token. And that's really all we need for that response. But now if it's successful, if the secret matches, we would normally have a try catch here, but I'm going to recommend not putting the try catch in at first. So if you have an error, you can see the details of that error inside of the console where Next.js is running here, especially after you build the application. It would be very handy to see that compared to just having a catch where it always gives you the same error. And that's what they show in the docs where it says error revalidating. You don't know what the error actually is. So it's better to maybe not catch that error in development and get more details in the console. So for now, we'll say const path equals request.query.path. And now let's notice the type here. So path is not necessarily just a string. It could be an array of strings or it could be undefined. But that's not what we need here when we use the revalidate function in just a second. So I'm going to use an assertion and I'll say as string. So we know path is a string and that's what we'll set it as. From there, we can await and we'll have response.revalidate. This is the important function, and this is the function that is currently only available in the revalidate file that comes through the API that is in the pages directory. And once again, I'm sure this will change in the future. And if revalidate is then later on available inside of the route handlers, for example, we would use the other API directory. But now let's just pass in the path value that we have. So that makes this path value very important. And of course, that's also being sent in the URL above. That's where we set the path equal to /, because we need to revalidate our home page, essentially, that has the list of blog articles on it. But whatever the path is, that could be altered. So if we needed to revalidate a different route, if we had a different route here inside of our application, here we also have posts, for example, and inside of posts, we have a post ID. And of course, this is a dynamic route. But if for any reason we needed to set it here to revalidate one of these pages, you would give that specific route. So maybe the posts/ID of 1 or whatever that would be. So you could provide that specific information for the path, and this handler would still work. Now, after this, we just need to return our response. So I'll scroll up just a little, and here at the bottom, we'll say return, if I didn't misspell that, return res.json, and here we can say revalidated is true. And that would be the good response there. Now, of course, once again, you could set this to a try catch. And of course, you would try the await and the return here. And if not, you would catch the error. But I think it's better in development that you see any errors happen inside of the console. Now remember, we cannot test this handler in dev mode. It will give you a 500 error, if I remember correctly. It's not going to work if you do npm run dev. So we need to rebuild our application. So I'll do npm run build, and I'll once again come back when the build is complete. Okay, we've built our application, and if we scroll up here, we can even see, I believe, inside of the blog posts, yes, there are only those 2 posts right now. We don't have the new one in there yet, so it will be added after the build. Let's go ahead and type npm start and get our application running, and then we'll go back and check it. Okay, we're back in the browser and we're running the application here, and we've got our 2 articles, and I can navigate between those 2 articles and back to the home page. Everything's looking good, so let's try adding the new article and then revalidate. Okay, back in VS Code, I'm going to close the terminal. Let's go ahead and collapse some of these other things so we can see more of what we're doing here, and we need to open up blog posts, and we're going to drag the new article back in to the blog post directory over here. So I'm dragging that in. That looks good. Now remember, at the top of the route here, we had put the revalidation path. So I'm going to copy mine, again, just using HTTP and then the localhost 3000. And then it has my secret right here inside of the URL. So Control-C to copy that. Now I'm going to use the Thunder client extension to test this out. You could use Postman as well, or some other client if you want to. So now I'll just open up Thunder client here, and I'm going to do a new request, and I will paste my URL directly in there, and a GET request is what's expected here. So you can see it breaks out the query params. So we've got path equals / secret equals my secret. And now I could send this, and we should get a revalidation response. And we did, revalidated true. Now I'd also like to highlight that we can also request whatever we had for that API. Was it hello? Or not that one, let's find it here. Here's our API hello. So that route also works with the build. And I'll send that and we get hello Next.js. Of course, that's the default one with the new route handlers. So again, they're both working. But our revalidated true did work, so now let's go back to our blog. Okay, I'm back in the browser with the blog. I have not refreshed at all, but we already triggered a revalidation. So now if we reload the page, we have our new post there. So we did not have to send a request or wait for any longer time to expire. We triggered that revalidation with our URL, with that new API endpoint that we just created. And once again, remember, you can only test this out with a build, not in dev mode. And so now that we've learned about this, let's talk about the workflow with your blog. When you add a new article, you should add the new article and then send that on-demand revalidation request. And of course, remember, this replies to however your blog receives data. So it could be markdown files like this project, but it could also be fetching data from a headless CMS or requests coming from elsewhere. And then remember to check back to the documentation, because sometime after version 13.3, I don't expect the pages directory to stick around, and those revalidate requests are probably going to be up in the API with the other route handlers. That's just my assumption though. I don't know for sure, but it would be great to see it work alongside those new route handlers. Remember to keep striving for progress over perfection, and a little progress every day will go a very long way. Please give this video a like if it's helped you, and thank you for watching and subscribing. You're helping my channel grow. Have a great day, and let's write more code together very soon.